Hello, this is Colin Liddell, the Chief Editor of Alternative Right. This is designed to be a short 5 to 10 minute long podcast, updating our readers and listeners on matters relating to the site and commenting briefly on events of the day. Today is March the 27th, 2017. Now, today I'm going to talk about the London terror attack, which happened last week, about 5 days ago, and it's been much commented on and reported in the media. It wasn't a particularly terrible terrorist attack. I mean, we've had much worse ones, but for some reason it seems to have had quite a big impact. I guess there are various reasons for that. The location was very iconic, right below Big Ben, attacking the British Houses of Parliament. Tourists killed, a combined car attack and knife attack. And the killer, the terrorist himself, appears to have been quite an interesting personality. And in the days following the attack, they've managed to dig up quite a lot of biographical information on the killer. And I guess the interesting thing is, because the killer is not such a kind of cliched type of Muslim terrorist, this makes him much more debatable. He's not really somebody that you can put in a box. And so that allows the left to argue from their side, and then the right to argue from their side, and then the conservatives to argue from their side. And they're all able to find different things in the story that can back up their agenda. In particular, I've noticed that the left and the conservatives, who kind of essentially share the same basic position, which is we have to coexist with this alien culture, regardless of the fact that it's continuing to grow and become increasingly hostile to us. The only difference between those two positions is that the left believes in more immigration and less assimilation, and the conservative right believe in less immigration and more assimilation. But the general drift of their policies are quite similar. Now, the alt-right, the nationalist right, the identitarian right believe quite differently. We believe that this is a fundamental structural problem that the multicultural West has, and that this problem will lead to great and growing conflict and death and destruction, and it has to be addressed in a very radical way. And by that, we basically mean that we have to not only stop immigration and increase assimilation, but we have to also promote repatriation as well in various forms. And also we have to have policies that address the demographic question so that native European populations can stay dominant in their own countries. Now, the opponents of the alternative right have been drawing attention to two facts. One thing they've been saying is that Khalid Masood, the terrorist attacker, was actually British and British born and had lived most of his life in Britain, and also he was half white with a white mother and a black father. And the other thing they've been mentioning is that he was not actually a good Muslim, because Muslims are, of course, the people of the religion of peace. And, a good Muslim would obviously not do that. Only a bad person would do that. And whether he did it or not would be regardless of his cultural background. Just a bad egg theory. Now, the first point, Khalid Masood is actually half British and born in Britain. That's a very interesting point. And it's not really a good point for the left to make, because it basically points to the transgenerational problem of assimilation. It's actually very, very hard to assimilate when you're a migrant coming to a completely different country In fact, I would say it's impossible. I'm still not Japanese, even though I've lived here for many years. But the problem is actually very, very deeply ingrained. Even when people's families have been in a country for several generations, if they come from a different culture, it's very, very difficult for them to integrate, to assimilate. And this even holds true when people are racially mixed. Now, this varies from, race to race and from culture to culture, but essentially, when people become racially mixed, they do go through a lot of problems with their identity. And identity is actually very important, and it's becoming more important. So we can expect these problems with identity that miscegenation creates to increase even further. Now, in the case of Khalid Masood, he seemed to superficially assimilate quite well in the earlier part of his life, although he had a regrettable tendency to violence. Now, he was born in 1964. His mother was 17 at the time. She had been knocked up, as we say in Britain, by a black African man. Now, in those days, abortion was actually very, very hard to obtain. And in 1967, Britain liberalised the abortion laws. So you could actually say that if abortion had been liberalised sooner, there was a very good chance that Mr. Khalid would not have been brought into the world. Now, Khalid was his Muslim name. His English name was Elms, after his mother. And apparently one thing I've heard is that his parents later married, although, who his real father is remains a bit of a mystery. But anyway, young Adrian Elms, as he was known, he seemed to have a few problems with the law, but he landed on his feet because he ended up marrying a rather rich woman who had her own company and living in a very plush part of southern England and having 2 daughters. But for some reason that didn't work out, and he moved on and he got into more trouble. His violent nature getting the better of him in certain situations, and this led him into prison and through the prison system into Islam. You could maybe see that as an attempt to get back to his ancestral identity, because apparently his father, if we are to believe that the man who married his mother was his father seems to have been a man of Nigerian origin and quite possibly a Muslim. For a mixed race person to become a Muslim, it's an attempt to achieve a kind of identity of sorts, even though in certain respects it's actually very inauthentic. So I think that side of the narrative just shows you the problems of assimilation. Now, there's plenty more that could be said about that, but I'm trying to keep this podcast relatively short. Now, the other point the opponents of the alt-right are making is that actually he wasn't a good Muslim. Now, this is actually a common argument made in the wake of these terrorist attacks. Whenever there is an Islamic-inspired terrorist attack in Europe, fully supported by ISIS or whatever, the media eventually do a bit of digging into the private life of the terrorists, and they find out that, actually these guys ate pork and they had a few beers. And in the case of Khalid Masood, we've had stories about his drug-fueled sex binges with hookers and so on. And, all those things are actually haram under Islam. And so, therefore, he could not possibly be a Muslim because he's not a good Muslim. Now, that's a ludicrous argument. The problem with Mr. Masood was not the fact that he may have or may not have had drug-fueled binges with hookers. That's not very commendable, of course, but it's not really a major problem for the rest of society. The problem we had with Mr. Masood was that he was driving his car on the pavement or the sidewalk, and that he was then stabbing people. Now, while taking drugs and shagging whores may very well be haram in Islam, driving cars into people you perceive to be kuffars or infidels in an act of jihad is not actually haram. Now, this is the problem with Islam. And also, interestingly, there's a very similar problem with leftism. And now in both cases, in Islam and leftism, there is this thing where you define a group of people as enemies. Now, the Muslim will call these people kuffars or infidels, and they will say that there is a state of jihad, and because of that, they are therefore entitled and morally entitled to go after these people and kill them or commit attacks on them that further the cause of Islam. The leftist has a similar system, and what they do is they define certain people as racists or homophobes or bigots, and that therefore gives them the moral right to commit acts of violence against them. And so you see the same pattern in Islam and also in leftism. A group of self-selected individuals subjectively decree certain peoples or groups or individuals to be enemies of the one true God or the one great multicultural future, and that then allows them to commit any kind of atrocity they feel justified in doing. Now, to a certain extent, I don't want to dismiss all of the left's positions on this case. I think it could be said that Mr. Masood was possibly mentally deranged. He was going through a bit of an episode. His life had fallen apart in various ways. He was, you might say he was going through the proverbial midlife crisis, which turned out to be an end-of-life crisis in his case. And, when people are under extreme duress, as we all are at different times in our lives, then we need strong support from our societies and our cultures. And if those societies and cultures don't exist, then what happens is that we end up lashing out in unexpected and dangerous ways. Now, what we've done in the West, we've created this vacuous anti-society, as anti-culture. We've destroyed our traditional culture, so there's no longer a culture, there's no longer a society. So that when people feel the stresses and strains of life, as they invariably do, then they have nothing to fall back on, nothing to calm them down. Or in the case of Mr. Masood, they veer towards a culture, a tradition, a system of psychological manipulation that pushes them towards very, very dark and evil acts. So I think this is a very interesting case, and Mr. Masood is an interesting individual because he cuts across a lot of the lines that we normally like to establish in these kinds of cases. But anyway, this is another podcast that has gone way over the allocated 5 to 10 minutes, so I'm getting out of here now. Over and out.